Please take your seats. Okay, we're going to start with our third panel for the day. Following the money trail, finding and freezing terror finance. Using the law to stop rogue states and terror organizations from receiving and transferring money is a critical weapon in the fight against terror. Panelists will discuss Shurat HaDin's pioneering use of civil litigation against terror groups. Please roll the film.
Non-state actors cannot operate without money. Without the money to purchase weapons and munitions, pay salaries, and win the support of civilian populations, terror groups and other non-state actors cannot continue to fight. How does corruption fund non-state terror? How can the law prevent terrorist groups from obtaining money through corruption? Do banks and financial networks which knowingly facilitate terrorist funding lose their status as civilian entities?
I'd like to introduce our moderator, LITAL SHEMESH. LITAL SHEMESH is a dynamic young Israeli journalist and news anchor. She currently works as a news correspondent for Yisrael HaYom. For years, she has reported on the political situation in Israel and advocated dialogue with the Palestinians to promote a solution to the conflict. Between 2008 and 2009, she worked as a news reporter for the Israel Broadcasting Authority and covered a broad range of topics, including social welfare, crime, security, economics, and culture. Please welcome LITAL SHEMESH.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. We're going to have a really interesting dialogue today about the funding of terror and everything behind it. And I would like to start with presenting to you our speakers of today. And each one of them is going to give you a few words of what they're doing, and then we're going to start the discussion. So Attorney NITSANA DARSHAN-LEITNER, we already know Attorney DARSHAN-LEITNER, the founder and president of Shurat HaDin. She has led and won a number of major, yes, she definitely deserves your applause. She won a number of major legal cases against terror organizations, resulting in more than $2 billion in judgments and collecting $200 million in compensation for victims of terror. Among many other initiatives, Mrs. DARSHAN-LEITNER has assisted in blocking Gaza flotillas, sued social media campaigns for allowing terror incitement on their platform, and filed legal actions against those illegally boycotting Israeli academic and companies. Mrs. DARSHAN-LEITNER, who holds a law degree from Bar-Ilan University and an MBA from Manchester University, is regularly quoted in the international media as an authority on terror financing. In 2012, she was chosen as one of the 50 most influential women in Israel by the Globes Financial magazine. So if you can just give us a few words of what Shurat HaDin is doing.
Okay. So Shurat HaDin is a civil rights organization that fights terrorism in court. We started in the year of 2000 when the Intifada broke out, and we saw that the blood is spilled on the streets. We realized that as lawyers, we can take a role in the war against terrorism. And we decided to do what lawyers do best, go after the pocketbooks of the terror organizations. Today, we're representing hundreds of terror victims in lawsuits and legal actions against Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PLO, Hezbollah, Palestinian Authority, Iran, Syria, North Korea, banks that provide financial services to terror organizations like Arab Bank, National Westminster, Credit Lyonnais, UBS, American Express Bank, Lebanese Canadian Bank, Bank of China. I would maybe give an example of the last victory in New York in the case against the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. That's a case that was filed in 2004. And I will just open with the story of one of the victims, Jonathan, little kid, 7 years old, who was walking on Jaffa Street holding his father's arm. And when they were going down the street, they came back from a class, they were heading home. There was a big, wide-shouldered man walking towards them. What they didn't know back then, that this guy was a Palestinian policeman who carried explosive vest in his vest. But not only explosive vest, he carried nuts and bolts and pins and everything he could have hauled on him. And the guy looked at Jonathan's eyes and blew himself up. Jonathan was rushed to Shurat HaDin hospital. He had several operations on him while the doctors are trying to take out all the bolts and knives and pins that went into his arms and his leg. In the end, they left one last pin in his brain that they were too afraid to take out. Back then, in the beginning of the Intifada, we knew what all the people in Israel knew, that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO are steering the Intifada, are calling people to kill Israelis, to kill Jews. They have a policy which they decided to carry out in July 2000 when they realized that the peace negotiations are not going to work. And in September, they broke out the Intifada. They were conducting and managing it for 4 years until Arafat died. So we decided to show the entire world that the Palestinian Authority is responsible for the Intifada. And we decided to do it through the court system. We took Jonathan's family along with other 10 families and filed a lawsuit against the PLO and the Palestinian Authority in the court in New York because we had evidence that all these terror attacks of these 10 families were perpetrated, assisted, and done by Palestinian employees, by Palestinian policemen, Palestinian security guards, Palestinian officials of the PLO. We filed a case. The Palestinian Authority hired a lawyer. They always do, a boutique law firm from Washington, who came to court, raised several objections like sovereign immunity, like jurisdiction issues. They even claim that the act of terrorism considered to be an act of war, and therefore no court to deal with the case. We fought back, and after 4 years, the court dismissed their motion to dismiss and allow the case to go forward. Last year, the trial opened in New York. I had to spend the coldest months in my life in New York, along with Rachel and Alona. And the Palestinian Authority had a defense. They said, indeed, they were our employees, but they were rogue employees. They did the attack after work hours. They were not authorized to carry out attacks against Israelis. They were not asked to kill Jews. It wasn't our policy to kill. But when the trial opened, they found it hard to explain to the jury how come until today they keep paying the salaries of the terrorists who got caught in these terror attacks, got convicted in the Israeli courts and sitting in the Israeli jail, how they send them a paycheck every month, how they promote them in rank every 2 years, how they pay compensations to the families of the suicide bombers, how they call town squares or the names of the suicide bombers. This is not how you treat rogue employees. This is not when you want to claim that your policy is not to kill Jews. There was no surprise there that by the end of the trial, the jury came back after a day and a half in deliberation and found the Palestinian Authority and the PLO responsible for all the terror attacks and gave a judgment in favor of the terror victims for $655 million. The Palestinian Authority they fired their boutique law firm. They hired a new one. They filed an appeal. We had the appeal a couple of weeks ago in New York. The State Department, unfortunately, came in favor of the Palestinian Authority. In order to file an appeal in the United States, you have to post a bond. The bond's supposed to be for more the amount of the judgment. The Palestinian Authority went to the State Department and complained that they cannot afford posting $700 million bonds in the court. The State Department asked the court to be considerate, and the court gave them a ruling to post a bond of $10 million only. They will take it to the Supreme Court. We will be there. We will fight until the end. I believe that we will win in the end, and that will be a case that the Palestinian Authority will have to pay money to the terror victims. That will be a case that the Palestinian Authority will realize that supporting terrorism does not pay, that they will have to pay $655 million to the terror victims. They will realize we told them that there is a price to Jewish blood, and nobody can kill Jews and go without pay.
Amazing work you guys are doing. I would like to welcome Ambassador John R. Bolton. You got some fans here. Ambassador Bolton is an American lawyer and diplomat who has served in several Republican U.S. administrations. He is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a senior advisor for Freedom Capital Investment Management, a Fox News Channel commentator, and consul to the Washington, D.C. law firm Kirkland and Ellis. Ambassador Bolton served as the Under Secretary of State of Arms Control and International Security from 2001 till 2005, as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from August 2005 until December 2006, and was a foreign policy advisor to the 2012 presidential candidate Mitt Romney. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today to address this important topic. I just wanted to cover it briefly from the perspective of trying to deal with state funders of terrorism and what we might do, what we have done that's been successful and what has not been so successful from that perspective. Because the state sponsors of terrorism, Iran being the best example, is the central bank of international terrorism, really pose a number of difficulties that help facilitate the transfers of funds to terrorists on down the line and through other mechanisms as well. Now, my own experience has been primarily in dealing with the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and trying to stop that activity. But I regard these weapons fundamentally as instruments of terrorism. None of the rogue states, not Iran today, not North Korea, that seek to have the capability, for example, of deliverable nuclear weapons pose a strategic threat to the United States. Their capabilities with nuclear or chemical or biological weapons are all aimed at civilians. And therefore, in their hands, the hands of these kinds of states are weapons of terrorism. And obviously, the worst confluence is if a state sponsor of terrorism that had nuclear weapons were to give or sell these devices to terrorist groups. We know from what we uncovered in Afghanistan that al-Qaeda has had plans to get weapons of mass destruction from the outset. We know that ISIS also would like to pursue that route, so that these threats really conjoin. Moreover, I think the techniques that you use to stop WMD proliferation and the funding of terrorism are very similar. I think that we can learn a lot from each other in the various paths, as we've learned from dealing with the funding of illicit narcotics trafficking, where a lot of the learning on tracing the money trail really began. And I can just say, from the government's perspective, if we had thought more carefully about what we knew about drug trafficking earlier, we could have been more effective both against terrorism and against WMD proliferation. Now, I think too often at the political level, the politicians and even the voters think that when you impose sanctions on a terror-sponsoring regime, that pretty well does the job, that the sanctions really have a major inhibiting effect on terror funding. Unfortunately, that's not true for a couple of reasons. Number one, these sanctions are not typically self-enforcing. Some countries have very good records of maintaining the sanctions and ensuring compliance by individuals and corporations and other entities under their control. Other countries couldn't care less. There may be international sanctions by the UN Security Council or regional organizations. The states themselves may adopt anti-terrorism sanctions legislation. They just simply don't enforce it, because for many countries, accepting international obligations is just something that they do to show that they're part of a larger universe, but they have absolutely no intention of enforcing them seriously. Moreover, there are sanctions and there are sanctions. My own experience tells me that the only effective sanctions against state sponsors of terrorism are when they're comprehensive in their scope and uniform in their application. I think too often in the past decade, roughly, we've seen, whether it's at the Security Council or at the national level, sanctions that are imposed targeting specific individuals or specific companies or organizations. As soon as you name the specific individual or organization, you're simply telling them they've got to do business under a different name. And it's not hard to do. The number of cutouts and false fronts that we see, the changes in names, the number of organizations that have hundreds of names and transact business with complete impunity demonstrates that when you try and target sanctions, inevitably you're going to be less successful than when you impose broad sanctions. And if you don't have the political will to impose broad sanctions, you're basically saying that the state sponsors of terrorism are not going to be restrained. And this is terribly unfortunate, but it's important not to let political leaders get away with saying, well, we've done X or Y in the sanctions area, and that's enough, and that those actions will in fact inhibit terrorists and their state sponsors, because they don't. So it requires, I think, a more alert public to continue to insist from national lawmakers that they not hide behind the false notion that imposing sanctions, whether at the international level or at the national level, necessarily accomplishes the objectives. Good intentions here are not enough. We've seen this over and over again. Let me give you the specific example of North Korea, which has an incredibly weak economy. It doesn't have much of anything to sell or export other than weapons. It has very limited access to international financial markets. The United States has had sanctions against North Korea since the Korean War in 1950. These sanctions, I think, were having a material effect because the Korean economy is so primitive. But yet we found in the Bush administration, I'm sorry to say, that we took North Korea off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, even though it had done absolutely nothing to account for the missing Japanese and South Korean citizens it had kidnapped over the years and taken to North Korea. We opened up access to North Korea's only international bank account, essentially, Banco Delta Asia, and it's been an incredible boost for the North Korean economy, such as it is. And what has happened is that North Korea's behavior has only gotten worse over time. So it's a further mistake to think that the relief of sanctions, which have a mixed record at best, that the relief of sanctions will influence the behavior of state sponsors of terrorism to make them less apt to engage in behavior. It's exactly the same thing we're seeing now in the case of Iran and the Vienna nuclear deal, which has unfrozen $100 billion or more of frozen Iranian assets and lifted the international economic sanctions. Iran's behavior broadly internationally has not changed one iota, as even the Obama administration has indicated. They've been given relief and not paid any significant price in the restrictions on their nuclear program. And I think as the leading funder of terrorism around the world, the lesson that the Iranians have learned is if you just keep at it long enough, nations in the West, like the United States, kind of lose patience and they say, why are we doing this? Why do we continue these sanctions? And the will to enforce the sanctions disappears. Moreover, I think that the sanctions and the state efforts to restrict terrorist financing have to be accompanied, to be successful over the long term, with clandestine operations as well, that often can't be discussed publicly, but which, when they are finally revealed, I think people can understand some of the consequences. And I want to use there, as an example, the AQ Khan proliferation network. AQ Khan, a Pakistani native, was one of the great entrepreneurs of nuclear proliferation. He started off by stealing the uranium enrichment techniques and knowledge of Urenco, the largest European uranium enrichment company, took him back to Pakistan, and that was the beginning of the Pakistani nuclear program. But AQ had broader ambitions, and he took the uranium enrichment techniques he had stolen from Urenco that had been modified and upgraded by a Pakistan nuclear scientist. He took the nuclear weapons designs that Pakistan had received from China. And we know that because the markings on some of the documents we recovered were in Chinese. He took this information, he took the enormous intellectual knowledge that he and others have, and he peddled it around the world. He sold information to Libya, he sold it to Iran, he sold it to North Korea, a real equal opportunity proliferator. He had manufacturing capabilities in Malaysia. He used Swiss banks and Swiss organizations to launder the money. He had operations across North Africa, in Niger, Burkina Faso, and other places. And he lived a kind of international life proliferating nuclear technology. Now, U.S. intelligence and other agencies were familiar with what AQ Khan was doing. We learned more and more as time went on. But it posed a number of very hard questions for us that I think are posed in the terrorism field as well. When you detect a network that's operating, when you can trace the flows of financial resources, when do you act to stop the network? You have to recognize that when you bring it to a halt, when you act against the agents in the network that you're aware of, several other things happen as well. Number one, all further information gathering is likely to cease because the people that you bring into custody, at least in the case of the United States, are going to be read their Miranda rights, and that's the end of discussion there. The same is true in other countries when they're put into their national criminal justice systems. Number two, anything that you don't know that's out there, you're not going to find out, meaning a vital part of the network might escape. And number three, obviously, you're going to restrict your capabilities to learn more about other contacts around the world. Now, the reverse of that is, obviously, you want to intervene before too much damage has been done. You don't want to wait until after there's a terrorist strike. You don't want to wait until after yet another country has been empowered to develop a nuclear weapons program. And I have to say, speaking personally, having watched our intelligence community go after the AQCON network and face decision points on several occasions when to intervene to stop the network and when not to, I was on both sides of the question multiple times, to bring it down now or to let it go on. It's a very hard question. But I think that the lesson that we learn from the financing point of view is that without the tracing of the financial flows into and out of AQCON's several bank accounts, we never would have been as close as we got, and we never would have been able to roll up as much of the network as we did. I think it's actually much harder in the terrorism field because there are less physical products being shipped around, but it shows once again that a nation has to have multiple capabilities to go after the financing networks, whether for terrorism or for weapons of mass destruction, because it's only by applying all of your national capabilities across the full spectrum that you can have even a reasonable prospect of success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. I would like to now introduce you to Attorney Brett J. Sander. Thank you for coming here. Attorney Sander is an associate of Frankel PLLC. Before he joined the law firm, he served as an attorney captain with the U.S. Army Jack Corps. During his service in the Army, he worked in the U.S. Forces, Afghanistan's Task Force 2010, investigating corruption and security risks in military contracting in Afghanistan. Additionally, Mr. Sander also represented the Army in civil litigation, and, and defended clients in multiple criminal trials. Thank you.
Thank you. So it was really interesting that you were talking about, or some of the speakers earlier talked about the role of judge advocates or our Israeli equivalents and whether this is positive or negative, but I can assure you what I'm going to speak about is where us as lawyers in the Army were able to find creative and positive solutions to help fight terror financing. I went to Afghanistan. I was part of a special task force called Task Force 2010, and our role was to stop the flow of DoD, Department of Defense money from going from the U.S. government to the hands of the Taliban and other bad actors on the battleground, such as narco-traffickers and foreign intelligence. So you're probably wondering, how is that possible? How does U.S. money, government money, end up in the hands of the Taliban? Well, it's because that there was no compliance in our contracting. Over in Afghanistan, we contract out with private companies for multiple things, from haircuts on our bases to the janitorial services to building new buildings. Today, I'm going to focus on one area of contracting, which was our supply chains. This is the trucks and convoys that distribute and take all our resources, fuel, food, and ammunition to different bases so that we can continue our fight against the Taliban. Now, as you may know, Afghanistan has a very difficult terrain, and has been described as a nightmare for logistic operations. You may recall the Soviet-Afghan campaign, and the Soviets were really never able to take control of Afghanistan, and a principal reason for that is because they used around 75% of their forces to control their supply chains. Taking a different tact, we contracted out our supply chain. We had, between us and our coalition partners operating under NATO, we had 200 different bases spread out around Afghanistan. And in 2009, before 2009, we had different types of contracts, but in 2009, we issued what was called the host nation trucking contract to 8 different prime contractors for $2.13 billion. And just to put that in perspective of how much money that is in Afghanistan, $2 billion is 10% of the Afghan GDP. So this is a huge influx of money into Afghanistan. Now our contractors there were 2 major problems with our contractors. First, the 8 prime contractors, they weren't the ones on the ground moving the supplies around. They contracted this out to subcontractors who further contracted this out to other subcontractors. And then the second major issue is that part of the contract was the prime contractors were going to provide their own security. It wasn't going to be U.S. soldiers trying to avoid the Soviet mistake. It wasn't going to be U.S. soldiers defending those convoys. And what happened is the subcontractors usually used Afghan national companies to provide that security. So that's the background and that's the basis for what happened. So let's move on. Later in 2009, investigative journalists started releasing reports that hundreds of millions of dollars were flowing to Afghan warlords, and in turn, some of that money was flowing to the Taliban. Alarmed by these reports, the U.S. Congress, one of the oversight subcommittees, started an investigation. They went out to Afghanistan. They interviewed the Department of Defense, U.S. Army commanders, as well as the different contractors who were involved in moving the supplies around. And they made 5 principal findings. The first is that these Afghan security forces that the subcontractors were using were usually Afghan warlords. And actually the report itself is called Warlord Incorporated. So the second is, if you chose not to use the Afghan warlords to provide your security forces, they were going to attack you anyways. The third is that money directly or indirectly flowed to the Taliban. The fourth is that the Afghan national government also took their money. And the fifth is that the Army battalion that was in charge of contracting for Afghanistan simply had no idea about what was happening for the last 8 years. So let me get to the first point. Early on in the war, there were several different groups with weapons, and the U.S. wanted a control of forces. So they only wanted one government to control arms. So many of the warlords incorporated, and they formed their own companies so that they could continue to act as warlords, but legitimate warlords. And what would happen is warlords control different sections of Afghanistan where different roads are. So one example is there was a warlord called, you can look him up on Wikipedia, Commander Ruhulu. He had about 600 men, and he controlled the principal route between Kabul and Kandahar, which you've probably heard of. So there were many trucks going on that road. With his 600 men, on average, he guarded 3,500 trucks at $1,500 per truck, so per month. So $7 million of American money was flowing to him. The second point, if you didn't pay the warlords, they were going to attack you anyways. Some of the prime contractors told the congressional subcommittee, we didn't contract with Commander Ruhulu because we knew he was a bad guy, and his men attacked us. Something said about another warlord is, no one leaves without paying. The third point is that this money went to the Taliban. It was hard to find direct evidence of this, but there are contractors who reported that Taliban commanders or members of the Taliban directly contacted them, or their security men on the ground, and asked for money directly. But really, it's the indirect paying, because the warlords had to pay off the Taliban, and that's evidenced by the numbers. The companies that paid off the warlords didn't get attacked by the Taliban, or it was a very small number, and the ones who didn't pay off the warlords, they got attacked by the Taliban. The Afghan national government was also in the take, and they, one example was they would take bribes from, they would also collect bribes from convoys. They would stop convoys and check for minor details, such as making sure that every security guard had his weapons registration, and if they didn't, they also took some money. But the primary problem was that the Army Command Unit, the 484th Battalion, simply stayed on their FOB, their forward operating base, and did not leave it to do inspections and see what was actually going on. This is despite contractors complaining for several years. So in one meeting, the commander for 484th said, I don't care about what happens on the road. My orders and my job is just to make sure that the supplies get to my bases. And that was the attitude. After the congressional report, my unit was formed, Task Force 2010, and it's probably good lessons learned to be implemented at the beginning of the next conflict instead of during the middle. Now, there was already a database where Afghan contractors had to register with DoD and provide us their information, such as the name of their company and their key personnel and their business licenses. But of course, it's interesting what Ambassador Bolton said about that companies, these key personnel would have one front. If you caught them and you announced who they would just change their names to another name. So our job as Task Force 2010 was to know who the bad actors were and to map their linkages so that if they went from one company to another shadow company, we knew who they were. And we were able to do that. We had intel units on the ground that provided based on classified and non-classified information. And we also had investigators at our bases who would question the employees of the contractors to get information from our intel reports. But the major issue and the major roadblock actually wasn't the intel, gathering the intel. It was the law, and being able to terminate these contracts and ban these contractors from future contracts. So we tried 3 different mechanisms to ban these contractors, and I'm going to go through them and tell you what worked and what didn't work. The first one is we tried the formal process. In the United States, in government contracting, we have what's called suspension and debarment. And any contractor that engages in criminal activities such as bribery, embezzlement, violation of the False Claims Act, where they've lied to the U.S. government, they can be barred. And what's great about that is the name of that company is put into a central database, and every government agency knows that not to contract with them. And we tried that. Our first year, we sent up the names of 43 individuals and companies to put in the central database. Unfortunately, the big army in DC said, no, there's due process involved, and we're not going to base it on classified intel. And they just said no. So we're stuck. So we went to Congress, and we asked them to pass new legislation, which is called No Contracting with the Enemy. And under that,
Very controversial.
yeah, right. And then there's new ones called Never Contract with the Enemy, because they don't always work. And what happened, but there were some mistakes with that. What happened with that was the person in charge of approving the companies that were designated and that could be banned was the Central Command Commander. The Central Command Commander is responsible for Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But the problem is the Central Command Commander is located in Tampa, which is not near Kabul. And if you're familiar with the government, getting a report from a foreign location such as Kabul and going through all the generals in the State Department to get a permission slip signed by the commander in Tampa takes a while. On average, it took 6 months to get a company banned, and at the end of 1 year, we successfully banned 5 companies. So this is where, to the lawyers, to their credit, we came up with the creative solution. On every base, the base commander, the general, is responsible for the security of that base, and he or she can kick off any person or company that the general believes is a security force to the soldiers. So if it's just an individual, for example, at Fort Hood, where I was based in America, the general could say, this individual is banned from coming on my base. And that's what we did in Afghanistan. We gave a list of the companies and the individuals we want banned from coming on the bases, and the general, for all the bases in Afghanistan, banned those companies. And once those companies were banned and couldn't come on the bases, they can't complete their contracts. And so then we terminated those contracts for convenience. And what we essentially did is we took what was a no process through the debarment to a 6-month process, and we made it a 17-day process. On average, 14 days to vet the companies through our intelligence sources, and then 3 days to get the commander approval. And there's still some kinks with that and issues, but I think this is an important lesson learned that hopefully the Department of Defense and our other NATO allies won't just put on the bookshelf, and will continue to look at as we go into future conflicts, and we know that we're going to use contractors. So I appreciate you, Shurat HaDin, for inviting me here and allowing me to share my story.
Thank you, Attorney Sander. And now we're going to hear a few words from Dr. Udi Levi. Dr. Levi served as the Director of the Counterterrorism and Proliferation in the Finance Bureau of the Prime Minister's Office. He is an expert in the era of terror financing.
I have the honor to speak with you tonight or this afternoon about a very close topic. I served more than 20 years, lead the Israeli campaign against terror financing and sanction against Iran. It's not okay. And so I can speak with you, I think, from a wide perspective about what happened since the beginning of the 90s. Then Israel decided that the campaign against terror financing will be one of the main tools in our fight against terrorism. And we did it because in the beginning of the Intifada, the first Intifada in 1987, we start to understand that this is not the same terrorism that we faced in the 60s. And if we concentrate only in our campaign to defeat the military wing, it doesn't help, because behind the military wing, that this is a very small portion of what the radical Islamic group doing, standing a huge infrastructure that even if you will kill every day 10 people that belong to the military wing, every day the system, the civil infrastructure, will create hundreds and thousands of people, because they have the education system, the welfare system, the health system, and the financial, a huge amount of money. And then we came to the conclusion that if we will find a way to cut the flow of the money to the terrorist organization, especially to the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, it will be the strategic tool. It's a good idea, but how to do it? How to do it, especially gentlemen and ladies, that I think we were alone in the campaign. First of all, we try to identify who are the enemy. And the enemy is not a battalion, and the enemy is not clandestine cells. We spoke about NGOs that, beside the good things that they are doing, they finance terrorist cells. We found governments like the Saudis, like the Emirates, like the Qataris. In those periods, nobody even mentioned the Saudis in the same list as a state-sponsored terrorism. We found persons, most of them from the Gulf countries. I have to mention here that when we spoke about those people, nobody listening, but after September 11, when the same names raised again as the sponsor of Al-Qaeda, they became familiar. But they started to finance Hamas 10 and 15 years before. And we start to go and to knock the doors all over the world to try to convince governments in the West and in the United States that we have to take actions against those elements and to cut the flow of the money. It was very difficult, very, very difficult. Nobody wanted to listen. We came with the proof, with the evidence, but it was very, very difficult. It took a few years to convince even the United States, our ally, to outlaw Holy Land Foundation, that was the first and the most important charity operated in the United States and helped Hamas in the territories. Nothing changed, and I want even to emphasize something that even today, if I'm telling you, you will think that maybe it's come from my sick madness or something like that. We came with a file. We found that, for example, one of the main sources of Hezbollah coming from counterfeiting dollars, counterfeiting the super bill, the dollars. We have a very nice file with a lot of evidence how Hezbollah and the North Korean and with the assistance of the Iranian counterfeiting the super bill. And we look who will be in the United States interesting with the information and will help us to do something against Hezbollah. So we asked, and they told us, if you're speaking about counterfeiting dollars, go to the Secret Service, because this is their responsibility. We came to the Secret Service, and it was very impressive, they say. You can tell us, please, how much money the Hezbollah counterfeiting? We have to admit that we didn't know exactly, but we said that we assumed that this is something around $50 million. I'm speaking about the middle of 90s. they say $50 million is nothing. It cannot affect at all the American economy. But we say, yes, but you know, it's a lot of money for terrorist organization. They say, you said terrorism? We say, yes, go to the FBI. So in the beginning, yes, now it looks a little bit ridiculous, but in the beginning, even not all the agency know exactly how to deal with the phenomena of terror financing. So they ask you to move from one agency to other agency. And unfortunately, I say, many things changed after September 11, many things. And I say unfortunately because more than 3,000 people died, but everything changed then. First of all, and I have to admit, the US Treasury became since then the most powerful organization in the world that lead the international terror financing, the campaign against terror financing all over the world. Before it was very difficult. Before they didn't have the full authority, they didn't have the responsibility. Only after September 11, they got a lot of powerful to do it. And then it became easier even to come with NGOs, elements that belong to our region, like Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and to ask from the Treasury to impose sanction, etc. Before it was very difficult. Even the activity against the banking became easier. And here I want to tell you something. Before September 11, we tried to convince the world that we have to take kind of actions against the Palestinian banks, that they were the most, the pipe, that most of the money that's going to the terrorism goes via the Palestinian banks. Nobody listened. And then, like actors in Hollywood, one day we took a dramatic decision, and Israeli police with the IDF make a raid on the Palestinian bank in the West Bank and ask from the manager with a list to give the money from the account of hundreds of terrorists, and we confiscate more than $10 million by using that way. Of course, I don't have to mention what was the reaction in the world against what we did. Even our best friend told us never do it again. But we didn't have any other choice. And then when we understood that we will not get any support from anybody, we took the first decision that maybe the best way to convince the banking to help in the campaign against terror financing is to use good lawyers that will be ready to sue the banking and to bring them to the court. And this is exactly what happened with the Arab Bank. Yes, it took more than 20 years, I think, almost 15 years. But finally, we won. So it was very difficult. But I can tell you that after September 11, when the US Treasury started the campaign against the banking, two things I have to tell you today. I think that today the banking system is clean than it was. I think that they never clean like they are today. And today is very, very difficult for terror organization or criminal organization to use the banking system as a platform to transfer money, because the banking system suffered in the last 15 years from sanction, from a lot of fines and punishment that they got billions of dollars. And now I don't know if you know or not, but today they have a personal responsibility. It's not only that they are going to pay a fine if someone will use them or will abuse them to transfer money, they have a personal responsibility, the manager. So today the banking is not an issue anymore. And today terrorist organization cannot move. I can't say, it's not totally, but they cannot move money freely by using the banking system. And this is the best achievement of the world, and especially the US Treasury, the assistant of all of us, to the campaign against terrorist organization. And of course, Saudi Arabia, after 2003, stopped to finance most of the activity after they understood that finally those elements trying to do everything against them. But there is no vacuum in our world, ladies and gentlemen. You are cutting one pipe, immediately they are finding another pipe. And when Saudi Arabia go out, Iran took more place on one hand and became more financier, and the criminal activity become more important to finance their activity. And when you have on one hand Taliban and Al-Qaeda that controlling Afghanistan and all the market in Asia, and on the other hand you have Hezbollah that controlling all the traffic from South America and to the east, you can find the two terrorist organizations, let's say, controlling almost all the traffic of the drugs all over the world. And it's not only criminal organization. When I'm speaking about criminal activity, it's not only drugs. They involve in all kind of activity, counterfeiting, pharmaceutical counterfeiting, extortion, kidnapping, whatever you need to finance their activity. So here, when the United States fighting against Al-Qaeda, because it was in the high priority, we tried to convince the world to fight against Hezbollah. But you know, Hezbollah is not exactly like Al-Qaeda. And Hezbollah, even in part of the country, it's not even, they don't have even the definition as a terrorist organization. So it's very complicated. And when we came especially to, I'm telling you before what happened in Syria, that now everybody understood who are Hezbollah. I'm speaking before. It was very difficult to speak even with the European about Hezbollah. Then we came to the conclusion that maybe the best way to fight against Hezbollah is not as a terrorist organization, but as a criminal organization. Because why? Yes, even if you change the definition, sometimes it's helping you. You know why? Because when you're changing the definition, the agency that you are working in the United States, it's different. When you define Hezbollah as a criminal organization, this is the DEA. And the DEA really don't care about any kind of definition. People that dealing with drug, it doesn't mean if you belong to Hezbollah or is a private person. This is criminal organization. And we did with them a lot of things when we start to work with them on Hezbollah from a criminal perspective. And we got a full assistance from them. But I have to admit that the other part, Iran, nobody took it seriously. Yes, I can say that when we impose sanction, the world, the United States, the United Nations, the West impose sanction on Iran, it's not a fact. Their donation, their support, Hezbollah and the terror activity. Yes, it's support. Of course, it's support because they have less money. But finally, the world, until today, didn't do something practically to deal with the Iran as a terror financing. All our activity in the last 10 years against Iran done from the sanction perspective, against the nuclear program and not exactly against. But today we have the new phenomena, it's called ISIS, and ISIS it's different because ISIS, it's not always that they have, that they are using all the methods of, as a criminal organization to get their money, but today they are like a state. They have oil, and they're getting money from tax, from the people, from the population. I have to admit that Hamas is the same. One of the main sources of Hamas today is coming from the population in Gaza. It doesn't matter that the people are poor, they are taking a lot of money by extortion or taxes from the people to finance their activity. What? Sorry, I didn't. Okay. This is one. Yeah, if you want one, yes, one of the problem with Hamas in Gaza that part of the money that coming for the budget coming on one hand from the UN by financing UNRWA, and the other hand by the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority doesn't have their money by themselves, so they are getting the money from the international community.
Yes, and Udi, if I may interfere and ask all of you a question about that issue.
Yes.
You were talking about countries who are consciously donating money to terror, but what happens when you have NGOs and countries that are donating money to one purpose, yet the money goes to a different purpose? For example, we can see in the Palestinian Authority, money goes to prisoners, to families of terrorists. In Gaza, you can't really monitorize where the money goes. So what do you do in that issue?
It was very complicating in the beginning to convince the legal system, and the same question that you asked the legal system asked from the beginning. Show us that the money finally going to finance the bullet, the kill, the victim or something like this, because they are very smart. Of course, they are not opening NGOs and charity that the main purpose is to finance terror activity. They are hiding the activity, and even if it's not directly going to finance act of terrorism, what they're doing, that finally the activity that those NGOs are doing is to give all the envelope, we call it. To give the support. If, for example, they are supporting the family of what they call the shaheeds, the martyrs, what does it mean? That, and we know it after investigation, that the martyrs understood that after they will execute and they commit the suicide attack or their attack, their family will get money, and their situation even will be better than what they have today. So how do you call it? Yes, it's not a direct support to terrorism attack, but if the terrorists understand that the situation will be better after he will commit a suicide attack or something like this, of course this is something that affects his decision to commit the terror attack. Finally, we convince in Israel, and I know that even in other countries, that this envelope is part of the terrorist network, and we cannot separate between them.
Just to add to this point, indeed, the American courts decided eventually that money is fungible, and you don't really have to prove that certain amount of money that you donated or gave to an NGO or to the benevolent wing of a terror organization went and found its way to a specific terror attack. That's happened in the case of David Boehm, the little kid that was killed many years ago in the beginning of the Intifada in Chicago. Indeed, this narrative or this ruling found its way all the way to the Supreme Court in the United States, where they decided no matter what you give to a terror organization, it's considered to be aiding and abetting, is assistant to the terror organization. You don't have to prove that what you gave them really winds up to facilitate a specific terror attack. And it happened in a famous case of Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project. A bunch of law professors from Harvard University decided that they are going to help the Tamil Tigers, a terror organization from Sri Lanka, how to get off the watch list of the State Department, how to present themselves better before the Congress. They gave them legal advice. They taught them how to speak nicely. And they were indicted for aiding and abetting a terror organization. So this professor came to court and said, first of all, we didn't give any support to the terror organization. We did not give them money, we did not give them weapons, we did not give them any material support. All we did is giving them advice, which, by the way, is protected by freedom of speech. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court ruled that you are not allowed in the United States to give any type of services to a terror organization, even if it's for free. Because if you give them something for free, it means that you freed up money that they can divert it and use it to a terror attack.
You were talking about the complicated issue with Iran and the fact that regarding the sanctions, you can't always satisfy the judgment. And I know that some of you had cases regarding Iran. What do you do in those cases now?
Can tell you what Shurat HaDin does. In the beginning, we tried to block the funding that Obama committed to give the Iranian regime due to the nuclear agreement. In the agreement, the Obama administration obligated to release $100 billion that was sitting in foreign bank accounts that belong to the Iranian regime. We objected it. We filed an injunction against the State Department and the Treasury, demanding that the State Department will not release this money because, first of all, we know where the money will wind up. Iran always said that they continue to support the terror organizations in the Middle East, and as Israelis, we were afraid that this money will find its way to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to continue carry out attacks against us. And second, we said it absolutely does not make sense that there are terror victims holding judgments against Iran for billions of dollars that weren't unpaid. And this money might be the last resource of these victims to enforce their judgments. So the lawsuit was dismissed due to lack of standing, but it did initiate some legislation in the Congress and the Senate for the same language that says that this money, the $100 billion, should not be released to the hands of the Iranian regime until they pay their judgment for the terror victims. And there is a new initiative in the Congress trying to build a fund to compensate the terror victims as a way to give them some money from some money that was confiscated by the U.S. government. Recently, we have holding the idea and the position that despite the fact that the whole world is dying to do business with Iran and they all contract with them to sell them weapons, planes, merchandise, the United States still is under prohibition to contract with Iran. The sanctions are still in place, and no American company should do any business with Iran. So when Boeing declared that they are going to sell 100 aircraft to Iran, we warned them that we are going to sue them on behalf of the terror victims that we are representing, put a lien on the aircraft because Iran should not get anything from an American company.
I admire all of you, really, for what you're doing. So how do you follow the money trail? How do you do it? Is it harder with terror organizations? Is it easier with states? Do you hire investigators? If you can give us some stories about that.
Like like in all the clandestine operation, first of all, the highest priorities is the intelligence. Intelligence, you have to get good intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very easy to say, it's very complicated to get. What does it mean? We are living in a world that we are getting intelligence about nuclear program, about the military, about weapons, about the intention of leaders. You try to ask from the intelligence community to collect information about money. It's totally different intelligence. It's totally different people. It's not the same people. For the regular intelligence people to ask to collect, you can give them all the intelligence in the world, but they do not understand it. So in the first things in our follow of money, we have to build a special network that include people from intelligence and people from the financial world. And not only people from the financial world, you have to find the way that beside the people that coming from the intelligence, you will put people from tax authority, from the banking system, people that familiar with the daily work with the follow of money. And when those people sitting together, you can get a good picture how to do it. But again, it wasn't so easy in Israel, and I'm sure in the United States too, to ask from people from Justice Department or from Finance, Ministry of Finance, to sit together with the people from the intelligence. This is people that not speaking every day the same language, and even they don't authorize to see the same material. So it was very complicated to bring it together. So it took us many years to build the system together. When we did it, we start to get good information. But even if you are getting good information, the question is what you are doing with the information. And this is something very complicated. And here I want to emphasize two things. In the intelligence world, and I'm sure that Ambassador can tell more than me about the diplomat world and how they are using, but you have the counterpart that you are share with him, the intelligence, and ask him to cooperate or something like that. But in the financial, for example, if I have a good intelligence about bank, the transferring money, and if I will go it, the FBI, it's easier, let's say in America, but not in Europe, to one of the services, like what we are doing on a daily basis. What do you think they will do with the information? They even, you cannot speak with them even, because they will not understand the language that you are speaking with them. So you have to find a mechanism that finally the information or the intelligence or the evidence that you have will go directly to the right people that can do something. But this is not people that you are working with them on a daily basis. So you have to build kind of infrastructure. We did it because, as I said, we took with us people, for example, from tax authority. So if we have a good information, we ask from the people from the tax authority to take the information and to speak with the right people in Europe from the tax authority, because they understand the language. But even here it's not easy. Why it's not easy? Because think about the idea that you have to release the information that comes sometimes from a very, very critic sources to give it to the civil agency. So I'm mentioning all this because I want you to understand that it's very difficult in the campaign against terror financing. And you have to build new mechanisms and new ways how to do it. But if you ask me, I think that today this is the ultimate tool that we have to fight against not only terrorism. I think, this is my opinion, that finally Iran came to the table because of the economical warfare against. And I want to emphasize that today, when I think that Iran is very vulnerable to financial attack, this is the right time to do what Shurat HaDin doing now. This is the right time now to impose the Iranian to pay what they lost in the US court, because they are very vulnerable to economical warfare.
Now we're going to get some questions from the crowd.
We have a short time. We'll get through as many questions as we can. I know this is hard to ask of a table filled with lawyers, but maybe try to keep the answers to a few sentences so we can get through as many questions as possible. This question is from Carrie Lenga from Ranana. I think it's directed at Ambassador Bolton and also at NITSANA. Earlier today, MK Yair Lapid raised the issue of Western countries subsidizing the activities of the UN and UNRWA when they are doing things so opposed to Israel and being so unfair. Is there something that can be done to go after this financial support?
Sure, but it requires somebody who's prepared to do it. And that's why presidential elections in the United States are important. If I had my way, I would, as U.S. policy, advocate abolishing UNRWA. And if we failed on that effort in the General Assembly, which is virtually guaranteed, I just cut off U.S. funding. So that doesn't solve your problem entirely, but it does take away 22% of their budget, and it might encourage the Europeans to think about it as well. I don't know what the full thrust of his remarks were, but I can tell you that the only thing that gets people's attention in the United Nations is when the United States threatens to cut off money. It has a remarkable effect. It's how we stopped the PLO from becoming a member of the World Health Organization in 1989. There's a long list I could give you. But until you're prepared to wield the financial weapon that you have, that is to say, the American contribution, the rest of it's just rhetoric, unfortunately.
NITSANA, anything we can do with the law?
Yeah, well, we did warn, or we asked politely the State Department to cut off funding to UNRWA. Did not get a response yet. Still, I don't hold my breath, right? But we did gave them a lot of examples of how UNRWA and their facilities in Gaza used the Hamas attacks in the recent war in Gaza, shooting missiles from kindergarten, from UN schools, using their ambulances to transfer terrorists, hiding launchers in their schools, and I'm not talking about the tremendous and horrible incitement going on in their schools against Israelis and Jews. And we asked them to cut funding. Legally, unfortunately, and we checked it over and over again, you can now take legal actions against UNRWA. They have immunity, they have sovereign immunity, diplomatic immunity or sovereign immunity. It's a UN organization. By law and by international conventions, they are entitled to immunity and they cannot be sued in court.
And NITSANA, this is a question for you. From a Shurat HaDin intern, we have interns who came from all over the world, from top law schools, to learn at Shurat HaDin this summer about the work that we do. And Sophia Lazarus from McGill University in Canada wants to know, regarding enforcement of these awards, we are often asked that when we tell people about Shurat HaDin, how effective are these judgments in actually fighting terror if you can't collect on them? So NITSANA, what is your strategy at Shurat HaDin for collecting on these judgments? You talked a bit about it with Iran, but perhaps with some of the others.
Yeah, let's open this panel for more issues than Shurat HaDin. But briefly, Shurat HaDin collected so far more than $200 million. And we did it by putting liens on assets that belong to those who lost their cases, talking about organizations and state sponsor. We have buildings, we have bank accounts, we have other type of assets that belong to these entities. We were able to confiscate it, put a lien on it, sell it, and get the money to the victim. Just quick examples, we found a house that belonged to the son of the Persian Shah. Years ago, the son of the Persian Shah wanted to become a pilot, so his father sent him to Lubbock, Texas, where they have a big Air Force base, and bought him a house. After the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the house became a property of the Iranian government. We learned about the house. We went to the sheriff in Lubbock, Texas. We gave him our judgment and asked him to force a sale on the house. Sheriff sold the house, gave us the money, and went to the terror victims. There are liens that we put on buildings in Queens, New York, in Manhattan. It's called 655th Avenue, huge building in Manhattan, halfly owned by Iranian bank that owned by the Iranian government, waited to be sold. The proceeds will go to the terror victims. We get some defendants to settle the case. Banks and other entities that don't want to take these cases until the end, that they are afraid to be hit with hundreds of millions of dollars of judgments, which they will have to pay eventually, settle these cases out of court. And here or there, we're still going after boats that belong to North Korea that just go on a reef on the Mexico shore, and get confiscated by them, or in the Panama Canal get caught. Literally every time we find information about Iranian, North Korean, Syrian assets, we are going after them. So there is a way to collect this judgment, but I want to tell Sophia, right, that the deterrence of the legal proceeding is more important than the collecting the judgments. Because if you bring these regimes to court and you manage a case against them, if you take for example, the banks, as a result of these cases, literally changed the way they were doing businesses, because no bank agreed anymore as a result of these cases to open bank accounts to designated terror organizations or to Islamic charities that identify with terror organizations. No bank agreed to operate in terror zones like South Lebanon, like Gaza. There is no banking system in Gaza. This is why we see them smuggling money into Gaza with suitcases in cash through the tunnels. But that caused a great deal of harm for the terror organization, for Hamas, who controls Gaza, because they need to bring hundreds of millions of dollars into the Gaza Strip. They cannot do it with suitcases and cash. And they need this money to control the Strip. They run a government in Gaza. They have to pay their population. They have to run the health and the educational and the welfare systems there. They have to pay the military, tens of thousands of soldiers that are on paycheck on a monthly basis. They have to pay their prisoners who are sitting in the Israeli jail. Salary that range between $500 to $2,000 a month. That's a huge amount of money for people who hardly make $300 a month. And they have to build their sophisticated underground tunnels, huge tunnels that they put hundreds, tens of millions of dollars into them. They need money. And if you obstruct the banking system to transfer money to the terror organizations, they found themselves in a big troubles. Terror organizations is like any other organization, any other corporation. Money is the oxygen. If you block the money, you can block the terrorism.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to our moderator. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. So I'll ask that all of you exit the stage. Thank you so much. We are not taking a break now. Please stay in your seats. I am pleased to introduce our next speaker. Please remain in your seats. We have another speaker coming on now. The panelists will be around later, I'm sure, for questions. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm pleased to introduce MK Avi Dichter. Avi Dichter is a current Likud minister